Good evening, everyone, and welcome to webinar episode number 1 of the Indigenous led Arctic Sovereignty and Climate Security. In short, ICASUS. This series is built on a simple but demanding proposition. Sovereignty in the north of our country must be co produced with Indigenous leadership at the center and climate risk integrated into every decision. Our project treats sovereignty not as control over territory, but as care of place, aligning national security with community resilience, ethical data practices, and environmental stewardship. That's the North Star guiding these sessions and the policy briefs and workshops to follow. Dear audience, on behalf of the Institute, I am Dr. Kausar Ahmed. Welcome you to this special session. Before we begin, let me do the treaty recognition. The Institute is based on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homelands of Métis Nation. We all are treaty people, and we are all promise bound to work together in the true spirit of truth and reconciliation. The audience, before I introduce our esteemed guest today, let me very briefly talk a little about the project, which is funded by Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security from Department of National Defense Canada. Our project, acronym ICASUS, reframes Arctic sovereignty, as I said, from control of space to care of place. And why this topic is important now? Because of two things. One is climate change, and also the shifting US and Canada's geopolitical relationship in the north. We all know Arctic is warming, at least 4 times faster than the global average, and the US has shifted to a more assertive monitor and respond posture. And this is why it is important to discuss about this issue today. This combination is changing infrastructure needs, logistics, and continental defense, creating both opportunities for us and US alignment and real risk of sidelining Indigenous governance if we don't design for it upfront. We are not producing another descriptive report in this project. We are co-producing actionable options that embed OCAP and care data governance, integrate climate risk intelligence into Canadian Armed Forces planning, and hardware Indigenous participation into security dialogue. Primary focus of our project is the Canada-US axis, especially NORAD modernization, continental defense, with a comparative circumpolar thread to avoid policy myopia and reflect cross-border Indigenous cooperation. As you all know, we have received the budget tabled by ruling Liberal Party, and there is a massive investment in the defense sector, and this is why it is also very important. Before we begin, quick ground rules to keep us sharp and respectful today. We lead with Indigenous knowledge, be concrete about trade-offs, and convert ideas into next step. Expect pointed questions and clear takeaways. And we are going to introduce our esteemed guest shortly. And the way I moderate this session today is to allow Dr. Ken Coates to speak as long as he wants to share his ideas and expertise. And then we'll do a very brief moderated question and answer session. So without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed guest. Dr. Ken Coates is one of Canada's foremost analysts of the challenges and opportunities facing the country. Raised in Whitehorse, Yukon, his northern informed views of Canada bring original and creative insights into contemporary realities. He works extensively on the impact of science and technology on society, particularly related to the world of work. He has deep insights into the issues facing rural and small towns in Canada, and conversely, the rise of the economic dominant city-states in the country. Ken has also written extensively on Indigenous rights and economic development, and has worked with Indigenous groups across Canada and internationally. He is a leading commentator on Arctic affairs and Northern development. Author of many books and articles, Ken contributes extensively to debates on television, radio, newspaper, and social media. He was chair in Indigenous Governance degree at Yukon University. What a pleasure to welcome Dr. Ken Coates, dear audience. And I will leave this space for him now. And here you go, Dr. Ken Course. Floor is yours, sir. Go ahead.
No, thank you very much for that very kind introduction and for organizing this webinar and the larger initiative that's underway. So I'll start by saying essentially the first and most important thing. We should have been doing this 30 or 40 years ago. That right now, no criticism of the organization, because that's not the point. The point is that it's taken us a long time to get to where we are now. And we've actually made a whole bunch of decisions that have made the challenge so much greater. They were bad enough 30 or 40 years ago. They're much worse now. So we've built the infrastructure in the north. We've expanded the resource economy very dramatically. We've transformed the global environment in some very dramatic and profound ways. We've shaped the geopolitical world without any input from Indigenous people. And recognize, I was born in Whitehorse, and not born in Whitehorse, raised in Whitehorse, and lived there in the 60s and 70s, and have been actively involved in the Yukon ever since. But if you look at the North, they had no input into the major decisions. So whether you're talking about the roads that were built, you're talking about the mines that were opened up, the oil and gas projects that were undertaken, there was actually no time at which the Indigenous peoples were consulted in the slightest way. So things like the Alaska Highway, which was built during the Second World War, they quite literally arrived on the doorstep of Indigenous people with tractors and bulldozers and started knocking down trees and building roads. And Indigenous peoples had absolutely no warning whatsoever. So let me give you a bit of a sense of why Indigenous peoples are so nervous about security and defense and all those kinds of things. There was a community called Teslin in the southern Yukon. In 1942, the Alaska Highway came through that community. During the first year, they had 5 epidemics. We just lived through one in the COVID epidemic. This community, a small Indigenous community, inland Tlingit people, endured 5 successive epidemics in a single year. 50% of all the children under 5 died in that 1 year. 50% of those children died. And adults and seniors as well. The seniors and children were the most vulnerable. Now, it was this is the United States Army was there. They very quickly turned their doctors and brought extra doctors in to look after the situation. They weren't able to respond very quickly because they had whooping cough and things like chickenpox that was not a major illness for most Canadians, was a deadly disease in the north. So they provided health and care as much as they possibly could. But of course, it was too little and too late. And so Indigenous folks all across the north have stories like this one. The disruption of their lives, the death through epidemics. They were some of the people who were working on the Alaska Highway would throw sticks of dynamite into the lakes, and they would blow up, and all the fish underneath would die, and they'd float to the surface, and they would go and grab them and have dinner. But they'd killed off a year's worth of fish in a matter of minutes. And you look at those kinds of things, and the Indigenous folks have an exceptionally long memory. Non-Indigenous people have incredibly short memories. In fact, they have almost no historical memory about the North at all. And so when people go up to the North as a miner, or they go up to the North as a member of the Indian National Defense or whatever, or even a politician, they'll say, we're here to do good works. And we're going to really help you. And we're going to look forward to you and forward to a good future and a collaborative future. Indigenous folks don't believe that, because they've been there for a long time and they've seen this thing wave after wave after wave. And for Indigenous folks, they say, well, we've been living for 50, 100, 200 years with the consequences of resource activity, government involvement, et cetera, et cetera. And so very, very slowly, the Indigenous folks are incredibly patient. They're extremely resilient. They fought back internally, protected their language as much as they could, their culture as much as they could, overcame residential schools. The biggest challenge, interestingly, has probably been state paternalism. In the period after World War II, the government of Canada decided that they knew best, and that they knew it was better to get the Aboriginal people off the land. It was better to sort of put them in reserve communities, put them in government housing, to provide them with social welfare payments, basically undermining the harvesting economy, undermining the sort of cycle of life that took Indigenous people from one place to the other, moving folks from a radius of a couple hundred miles and putting them on a single reserve. There's communities up north where there are families that actually track back to 4 or 5 different cultures, all living in one community. And the non-Aboriginal people look and say, oh, that's a First Nation community. Well, no, it's not. It's actually got 4 or 5 different First Nations all in one place. So that the hands of government was extremely oppressive in the 1950s and 1960s. And at the same time, government was patting itself on the back and saying, look how good we are. We gave them schooling, residential schools and day schools. We gave them housing, not very nicely built houses that were designed for Southern Ontario. We gave them money because the fur trade was destroyed basically for a variety of reasons. And we kept them alive during these hard times. We're good. We know what's best for them. We're going to do what's in their best interests, et cetera, et cetera. So through all of this, Indigenous folks survived. They struggled, they survived. They were damaged very severely by these processes. And we see that showing up in all the statistics of the social and economic difficulties. So now what's happened is that in the 21st century, we've had an awakening. And we've had an awakening, quite honestly, not because of problems in the Indigenous community, but because of problems in society at large. So our interest in the Arctic is not really driven by the fact that you have a suicide rate 7 or 8 times the national average in Nunavut. It's not really driven by the fact that you have a massive fentanyl crisis in the Yukon and Northwest Territories, way higher than anywhere else in the country. It's not driven by the fact that in parts of Nunavut, you have houses that were built for 5 people, have 15 people living inside. Massive overcrowding. It was not driven by the fact that you have virtually no employment in many of these communities. You have almost 100% welfare dependency, maybe 80% welfare dependency, depending on the community. The reason we're interested now is because the Arctic is threatens us. The changes that are happening in the environment are actually going to cause problems for the rest of Canada. The melting of the ice, the melting of the permafrost, all these kinds of challenges. We're really interested in Arctic security now, much more than we've ever been before, but not because we weren't driven by the fact that the Inuit were vulnerable or that people might attack them. They were about the fact that the Russians might come at us or that Chinese interests might take over our sovereignty, not Indigenous sovereignty, but Canadian sovereignty. So our starting proposition is self-interest, to put it in the most blunt and obvious terms possible. So the most important thing is you have this debate and this discussion about where to go. The most important thing is humility. We have to understand our role in the past, the things that we did wrong, the things we could have done better, the damage that was done by non-Indigenous people moving on to Indigenous territories. But we also have to understand and recognize and respect the wisdom of Indigenous people. These are very, very talented individuals who've survived in a very difficult environment. It's cold up there, if you haven't noticed. It's dark in the winter, bright in the summertime. There's lots of mosquitoes. There's a whole bunch of things that are quite challenging for non-Northerners. And they did very well. They had a good life, a very good life. Well, even as early as the 20th century, 1900, 1910s, Inuit silver fox hunters in the Western Arctic were making more money per year than the average industrial laborer in southern Canada. They were not even poor people by Canadian standards. They were actually doing quite well, and they adapted and survived and flourished in all sorts of ways. So we're southern Canada and the rest of the world is coming to the understanding of the role of Indigenous people, the impact of external forces on Indigenous people, and our collective responsibility. And so I completely support your starting proposition, which was the fact that we have to do something better in the North, and that co-production is the only way to go. But we have to make sure that co-production is not co-optation, that we aren't simply just doing something, my apologies, my light has gone out.
Dr. Ken, take your time. No worries. Take your time.
Sorry about this.
No problem.
You can edit this out, right? Oh, I don't. Hold on 1 second.
No worries. Take your time. So, dear audience, we are listening to Dr. Ken's comments, especially as he was narrating historical backdrop of our relationship with our Indigenous people from the North. So I'll request Dr. Ken Course to kindly pick up from where he left. Dr. Ken, go ahead, sir.
Yes, my apologies.
No worries.
I think what we've got to do is make sure that co-production is not just another word for co-optation, that we're not simply trying to grab the credibility of Indigenous people or grab their knowledge and attach it to our work and to sort of say, look at how good we are. There's a real patting on the back phenomena here, where we look at the work that we've done and we say, look, we've talked to the Inuit, we've talked to the Dene, we've talked to the Métis. They're consulting with us, we consulted with them. So this product is now our joint product. And we go out to the world at large and say, look what we did. Look what we did as non-Indigenous people. And we brought the Inuit and we brought the other northern peoples into our world and into our life. That's a real temptation on the part of non-Indigenous people. I was at two very major conferences in the last year on Arctic affairs. And I found them both very, very troubling. Because when I got there, there were very few Indigenous people. There was a whole bunch of people from Southern Europe in particular, and Scandinavian countries, the United States and China, talking very earnestly about the northern issues. I'm not sure if they could find the North on a map. They were, I'm exaggerating to make a point. It was like a meeting in 19th century Europe, people talking about Africa. And the North in that environment was an abstraction. The North was like talking about a herd of caribou or something like that. And I actually pledged that I wouldn't go back to those meetings again because I found it so upsetting. And there were Indigenous people there. And when they were speaking, almost all of their sessions were in small rooms off in the corner. The big plenaries were for cabinet ministers and premiers and big leaders and government officials and blah, blah, blah. And they weren't involving Indigenous leaders in a very direct way. And so in these smaller sessions, the Indigenous knowledge was fantastic. Their insights were impressive. They had lots of things to say. They were really, really talking about good things and it was so informative. And they had audiences of 50 people, whereas the other meetings had audiences of 400. So they were still getting it wrong. And we think that because we're talking about the Arctic and we're saying sympathetic things, and this is no way a comment about you, because I know the kind of work that you're doing and your attempt to bring Indigenous people into your conversations. But you could just see how much they were sort of doing the sort of the standard practice of co-opting Indigenous people in order to make themselves sound more pure and more convincing. So if we're going to do this properly, we have to start off with two understandings. The first one is listening to Indigenous people to sort of see what kind of North they want. What are their issues? What are their priorities? What are their aspirations? Then we consult, second point, you consult with Indigenous people about how what we see about the Arctic is changing and what things we can do differently that will actually ensure that they get a better life and that things go along more systematically. That would be a really good thing to do. We aren't doing those things yet. And I'll use an example from Canada just to reinforce this point. Earlier this summer, we passed something called Bill C-5, which is the Build Canada Act. And the idea was we're going to build northern infrastructure. And if you look at the 2025 budget, which just came out on November the 4th, you'll see an awful lot of conversation about these big projects and projects in the national interest. And they don't mention which ones they're going to do. But many of these are in the Arctic and in the North generally. When Bill C-5 was done, the government passed the legislation and then consulted with Indigenous people to say, what do you think about this? Well, in the lead up to this, the Indigenous folks were saying, don't pass this legislation until you talk to us. We might want to be part of the process of drafting the legislation. This is going to affect us more than anybody else. It's going to happen on our territories. It's going to affect our environment. It's going to harm and change our homelands. So don't do this. Don't pass this legislation until you've actually spoken to us first. So the current government decided they would actually not consult with the Indigenous folks. They would pass the legislation, and then the Prime Minister went on a roadshow. I'm not saying that to be flippant. He was very serious about this, and he went and talked to 3 different groups of the Métis and the Inuit and the First Nations and talked to them about the arrangements. Well, they weren't very impressed. Their comments basically were along the line. They were polite, and they listened carefully, and they made some contributions. But the underlying tone was, why are you asking us now? If you really wanted to consult, you would consult ahead of time. And I think you would do it the way I've suggested, not because I have all great ideas, but only because I listened to Indigenous folks for 40 years. is that ask them what their challenges are. So, for example, in southern Canada, there's a very strong belief that Indigenous people oppose resource development. You'll hear this all the time. And well, I'm protesting pipelines because Indigenous people don't like pipelines. I'm protesting oil and gas development because Indigenous people don't like oil and gas development. There are 350 First Nations in this country that have oil and gas projects on their territories. 350. That's actually a really hard number. The pipelines that were built across Canada from Alberta to BC and through across BC and from Alberta to central Canada have been built with very strong Indigenous support and very strong participation. There are over 400 agreements between mining companies and Indigenous communities redefining the way in which development actually takes place. Now, are they perfect? Absolutely not. Can we do better? Absolutely yes. But it's a huge transformation from 30 or 40 years ago when there were no consultations at all. So we're doing better in these regards, largely because we've been forced to by the law. We actually realized we weren't following our own laws, our own Canadian laws, and doing all of these kinds of things. So we're doing better, but reluctantly. We're not really excited about this. Most Canadians have never been to the Yukon Northwest Territories or Nunavut. Very few Canadians travel up there. You go up to Yellowknife in the middle of February and March, and there'll be hundreds and hundreds of people from Japan, China, and South Korea because they come up to see the Northern Lights. And if you look around with a flashlight, you might be able to find a occasional Ontarian or even a British Columbian, but not very often. I'm exaggerating again to make a bit of a point, but these are places that foreigners find more attractive. There's a huge German interest in the Yukon. There's not a very strong maritime interest in the Yukon. Not many people come up there on their holidays. The Canadians holiday in Florida. And we save our holidays for the wintertime. We don't save our holidays for the summer in the north, and we rarely go north in the winter. So Canadians have a very arm's length exposure to the north. And it's actually less than in the past, because if you go back into the 50s and 60s, we started building a whole bunch of company towns. When we built a mine, we built a pipeline, we built an oil field, we would actually build a whole company town with hundreds of people moving into the area and staying there maybe for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And it meant that many, many Canadians, Canada was a much smaller population back in the 60s and 70s, but many Canadians had a family member or a close friend who had lived or worked somewhere in the north for a fair piece of time. So people talked about it a lot. Now there's many more workers up there in the north, but they fly in and fly out. They don't live there. They live in Montreal, they live in Vancouver, they live in Nanaimo, British Columbia, they live in Winnipeg, and they fly north, work for 2 weeks, come back for 2 weeks. And when they're there, they stay in camps. They don't live in the communities, they aren't part of the communities, they're in separate camps, they're completely self-contained, they may as well be in a spaceship, given how the limited contact with the local population. So the country has some very odd dynamics right now. The fastest growing part of Canada are the city-states, Vancouver, Calgary, maybe Edmonton, not Winnipeg, but certainly places like Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa, not Halifax. And these are where the economic power in the country is in these locations, absolutely in these locations. And they're driving the economy, and they drive the politics of Canada. And they also attract the vast majority of the immigrants into Canada, live in those major cities as well. And we haven't done a very good job at all of making new Canadians feel welcome in the north, or making new Canadians have a sense that they're responsible for the north, which is why the project that you're taking on is the kind of thing that's really important. We have to build nationwide interest in the Arctic. It builds a sense of this similarity of interest, overlapping of interest with Indigenous people. And we most importantly have to get all non-Aboriginal people excited about learning from Indigenous folks. It's a privilege to do so. It's a huge, wonderful opportunity to be part of that world and to hear what they say about climate change, to hear what they say about the potential role of China in the far north, resource development and resource extraction, energy production, non-renewable and renewable energy sources. These are huge issues in the north, and the Indigenous folks have a different perspective. And I guess I would end by saying this as well, that we have to be also careful when we have this conversation, that we don't try to sort of historicize Indigenous people and put them back in sort of a 19th century sort of image of hunters, trappers, fishers. Some of them still are, and quite a few of them still are. Many of them do that on the side of their regular jobs. They work for government, they work in the private sector, they have their own companies, they're doing all sorts of other things, and they go hunting, fishing, and trapping. But they don't do the hunting, fishing, and trapping as their sole activity. And so when we do this process, the Indigenous people are not going to act the way we want them to act. They're going to act and they're going to live the way they want to live. And so when you listen to them, and they will say over and over again that they're kind of sick and tired of being poor. They're sick and tired of being so marginal within Canadian society. They're not opposed to being wealthy. They're not opposed to having regular jobs, not opposed to resource development and that kind of thing. That we have to start listening way better than we have in the past, which is why your project, I think, is so very, very important. So as we sort of start this process in the work that you're doing, I think it's a really a wonderful enterprise and a really, really valuable one. And it has to be, it's one of these interesting things. I remember, you'll understand this from what you listened to me so far. I was talking to an Aboriginal friend of mine in the Yukon. He's a very famous artist. And we're sitting here having a long conversation. I'm chatting away and asking him lots of questions. And then he finally says, after about an hour, he says, Ken, it's okay to stop talking. And I said, what do you mean? I thought he was mad at me. And he wasn't. He was a very gentle man. And he said, you have to learn to listen more. And I hope that the initiative that you're taking on has that listening front and center, that you listen to Indigenous folks for their perspective on what they need out of Canada in the 21st century, but also listen to their perspective on how they see the world unfolding. And maybe I'll end with this, is that, we need to really understand, I think, the effects of climate change. Because I know that's absolutely central to what you're doing. For the vast majority of Canadians, climate change is an abstraction, and it's a future worry. You, I know, live in Winnipeg. And people who live in Winnipeg, I used to live in Winnipeg and Brandon in years past. People who live there think, oh, yes, please. A little bit of climate change might be a good idea, as long as it doesn't get colder. So if it actually gets warmer and winter gets shorter, a little bit more rain in the summer. I live in Saskatchewan, and I think, okay, when climate change happens, it isn't all for the worse. Some places get better, easier to live in, right? But for most Canadians, it's not something that's actually in their faces very much. And when I know you're from Bangladesh, and in Bangladesh, climate change is tomorrow's challenge. And actually, it was last year's challenge, and it was 5 years ago challenge. And you're talking here about tens of thousands of people dying because of flooding in the major rivers. These are not small things. These are whole villages being wiped out. These are hundreds of deaths, disease spreading very rapidly in poor areas. In Canada, we don't really have that. So once in a while, we are attributing far too much to climate change. Sometimes people say all the forest fires are caused by climate change. Some of them are. Some of them are responsible. We're responsible because of our forestry practices. We aren't looking after forests properly. And you have an occasional sort of problem with torrential rains in British Columbia for a week once every 10 years. Yeah, those might be associated with climate change. I'm not a scientist, so I don't really know. But in general, climate change is an abstraction. It is something that might happen to the world as a whole, or is happening to the world as a whole, has limited impact on me so far. But when you look at Indigenous people, let me use one example. Just outside of Yellowknife, there's the First Nations north of Yellowknife have lived off the caribou herds for generations, and they've been very dependent on these herds, which were quite large and quite reliable. Not as large as the ones in the far Arctic and the northern Yukon and on the Barren Lands, but actually quite large and very dependable. There's a seasonal cycle, and you go out in the fall and you start shooting 10 or 15 caribou and you dry the meat, and that would last you to the winter. Well, over the last 10 years, the caribou have disappeared. And there's a really quick story that sort of just brings us to home that the biologists in the Northwest Territories are world leaders in co-management. They have no problem with sitting down with Indigenous leaders and elders and saying, you know these better than a biologist who flies up from the University of Toronto, counts caribou for a couple of days and then goes home again. I exaggerate, and that's not to be cruel to the University of Toronto. These Indigenous folks have lived with them for generations, and their people know about them very carefully. So they actually develop these plans really, really carefully. So they had a big meeting in Yellowknife, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago. And they brought the elders together and they brought the biologists together. And the biologists came up and they said, we are going to have to ban the caribou harvest this year. There will be no harvesting of caribou this year. And the biologists are really, really upset. And the elders said, we agree. We don't, we're working with you and we don't want to not be able to hunt, but the numbers are so small that if we go and kill 50 caribou, we're going to reduce the breeding stock down to close to zero. And I wasn't at the meeting, but friends who were there were saying, the people in the room were crying on each other's shoulders. They were so upset. But it was the elders and the Western scientists who were really upset. They were upset together. They actually trusted each other. They wanted to co-manage together, but they were forces beyond their control. This is not just a matter of a little bit of regulating the hunting. This was the food production had disappeared. The reliability of the herds had disappeared. Harder to get across some rivers because the waters were too high or too low. All these problems were sort of mounting up, and neither the elders from the indigenous community or the knowledge keepers or the Western scientists had solutions. They were really shared the problem, and they really identified the shared problem. And so recognize that in these communities, this stuff is not as abstract as it is in Toronto or Winnipeg or Saskatoon or Vancouver. So there's a couple of communities on the coast of Alaska that were wiped out this last month. They had a huge problem with all sorts of difficulty with the water coming in great storms, and they literally wiped out communities. They had flooding that destroyed the communities just almost overnight, and very few people died. That wasn't the outcome, but they were seriously dislocated. Their houses have been destroyed. The villages probably have to be relocated, and that sort of thing. In Acadian context, the community of Tuktoyaktuk, which is north of Inuvik in the Mackenzie Delta, it's actually on the Arctic Ocean. The water is right up to the houses. Right, if you have been in there a couple of times, and if you go there, they have built freezers into the permafrost. They dug a big hole, and the permafrost actually is the freezer. It keeps all the food cold, and they can catch caribou, they can catch fish, they can put it down there, and it'll freeze, it'll stay good for the entire winter. Now the water's getting in because the ocean is lapping up there, the coastline is disappearing, the sloughing down. And if you look at the problems with the coastline in Nunavut, it's unbelievable. The coast is eroding at a very rapid rate. So this is not the same kind of abstraction that it is in southern Canada. The people live with this on a daily basis, and it shows up in migrations of birds, in the nature of the fish. It shows up in a whole bunch of areas, not always for negative impacts. So if you look in the Eastern Arctic, they're doing a lot more commercial fishing than they did before. And it's because the water is getting warmer, and the fish that used to be down on the coast of Newfoundland are moving up because there's more food for them up in the Davis Strait and up along the coast of Baffin Island. So you now have Inuit with big commercial fishing vessels making money and creating jobs. It's a good thing. But climate is changing, and people are seeing this in very different ways. So that's a sort of a long ramble, and I apologize for this, but I'll end up, because I know you're interested in the security side and the sovereignty side as well. There's a wonderful phrase that one of the government officials responsible for the North said in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And they said basically that Canada manages the North in a fit of absence of mind. That at that time, we basically ignored it completely. And that's true. We actually didn't even want to get control of the Arctic Islands. They were forced on us by Britain, or given to us by Britain in 1880, when Canada was still only a baby country. It was only, at that point, 13 years old. Right? And Britain came and said, why don't you guys take the Arctic Islands as well? And they said, we haven't even got control of Winnipeg yet. And you want us to sort of take the Arctic Islands? Yeah, we don't want to have these. And they're worried about the Norwegians taking them over. So we sort of got the Arctic Islands because of worry about Norwegian and American influence in the region. But we had this fit of absence of mind where we didn't take it all that seriously. And we're better now in the sense that we recognize as a country administrative responsibilities for the far north. We realize our legal responsibilities and ethical and moral responsibilities. We're doing more, but not all that much, and certainly not on the sovereignty side. So we've actually used Indigenous people to sort of protect and project our sovereignty onto the world. these are Inuit communities, and they're Canadian Inuit, so therefore this is our territory. We have a very minimal military presence in the region, and the military people say that's fine. In order to defend North America, we don't need any more. But if you're sitting up there by yourself in the far north, and there are Chinese, in quotation mark, scientific vessels in the area, and you worry about them, and we know the Russian belligerence is getting more aggressive sort of all the time. So we haven't really integrated the Arctic into our sort of worldview. Well, why is that? 90% of Canadians live within about 150 to 200 kilometers of the Canada-U.S. border. We have well over half the population living south of the 49th parallel. If you think of Winnipeg, way over half of the population lives south of Winnipeg. Winnipeg's not exactly a northern community. It's not very far from the border itself, 150 kilometers or so away. So we haven't broadened our imagination and our understanding of Canada to really incorporate the North in any real sense. We've always left it to the government or left it to other people to sort of worry about it. So we do respect the Aboriginal folks. We're supporting Nunavut. We're supporting the self-government in Indigenous communities. We're supporting modern land claims treaties, resource revenue sharing. There's lots of ways in which Canada's done a better job of supporting Indigenous folks. But it's actually, we haven't really made it part of our nation in any real meaningful sort of way. And I'll finish up with this one story because it's this sort of, back in the 1970s, I was working on the Alaska Highway. So sad man, I know that's a very, very long time ago when you weren't even born. So a long, long time ago. And I'm on the Alaska Highway. My job was counting cars. So we used to call a Trudeau job, referring to Pierre Trudeau, summer jobs that had no value. But my job was to count cars going in both directions. One car going north, two cars going south. And on the Alaska Highway, particularly in the middle of the night, there'd be one car an hour coming by. So it wasn't very hard work. But I started keeping track of where they were from. That wasn't what we were asked to do, but I started writing down what province and territory they were from. The whole summer long, there wasn't a single week when there weren't more people from Florida, Texas, and California than from all of Canada east of Alberta. So all the maritime provinces, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, had fewer people than Texas, Florida, and California. Why were they doing it? Because the Americans had a huge military operation in Alaska. So they were sending all sorts of troops coming up there and people who were serving the troops and working with the troops and stuff like that. And Americans are far more interested in the frontier than Canadians are. And we had virtually nobody from Central and Eastern Canada coming up the highway. Right? And so it really reinforced to me as a Yukon, I said, what the heck is going on here? Why are so many more Californians coming all the way up here just to go up and see Alaska and to see the Yukon, which has almost mythical qualities in the United States and is largely irrelevant to most Canadians? So at different times, the Americans have been interested in the Arctic. They love the Klondike Gold Rush. That was largely an American phenomenon. They built the Northwest Defense Projects during World War II, Alaska Highway, Norman Wells, the Canal Project. Americans did all of that. They paid for it all. We paid them all back at the end. The Cold War, Americans are the ones that made sure we had the distant early warning line because that's a front line of defense for the potential intercontinental ballistic missiles that might land on North America. And now the Americans are getting interested again. And they're threatening our sovereignty by saying that, the Northwest Passage is an international waterway. So we want to go sailing through there. We don't need Canadian permission. And we're sitting back and saying, well, what if we say no? Can we actually defend that? Can we support it? Not really. So we're now very much aware of our vulnerabilities. We're scrambling. The current budget has all sorts of promises about a 5% defense spending. I'll believe it when I see it. We have one of the slowest defense procurement systems in the world. It takes forever and it's very political. And where ships coming way too slowly, we're going to start building submarines and all these other kinds of wonderful things. We spent decades trying to buy new fighter jets for the North, and we haven't bought them yet. So it goes on and on. And sort of we always keep hoping we can punt the problem to the next decade, to the next government, or the next decade, or the next generation. And I guess maybe because of climate change, security concerns, the changing geopolitical world, we realize that the time is now. And we now are asking Indigenous people to help us. If I was them, the primary question would be, you waited so darn long. Why would we help you? But they will help us. The interesting thing is they're very forgiving people. They're very understanding. They accept our weaknesses and our failings as a country and as a population. And we're very fortunate that they do so. So their hand is extended. They want to be part of the process. They want to be part of the solution. And maybe we're on the verge of doing something right. So that's probably enough for me to get started, for us to get started with the rest of our conversation. But I hope that's okay.
Absolutely, absolutely, Dr. Ken. What a wonderful, I would say, the explanation of why we are doing something that should have been done decades ago. Actually, I don't have this, intention to summarize what Dr. Ken Coates so eloquently told us from his own experiences. And this is really important for us to understand that we Canadian yet to acknowledge and recognize that this is our part of our history, our culture, our nation, because we have never paid attention to it, as Dr. Ken Coates rightly mentioned. And before we engage Dr. Ken Coates with some of the questions, and today we have Sadman Sakib, our research assistant, helping me. Dr. Ken, I keep wondering when you were explaining so nicely about our situation. So, according to your observations over those decades, why it is so troubling for Canadians, Canadian governments after governments, to understand the importance of the North, and why we have failed to invest in the North and include indigenous, contributions and participation. Why is that? Because it is 2025.
So I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if I was sitting down with a group of average academics and graduate students and stuff from Southern Canada, and if somebody asked that question, I would say, have you been up there yet? And they would say, no, we haven't. Oh, we'd love to go someday when somebody pays our expenses, right? If you want to fly from Winnipeg to Resolute Bay, and Resolute Bay is sort of up just on the south end of Ellesmere Island, it'll cost you about $4,000 return. You can go around the world cheaper. You go to Bangladesh and back much cheaper than you could actually fly to Resolute Bay. It's unbelievably expensive. And why we tolerate that is beyond belief. We shouldn't. Right? Other countries subsidize northern travel, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Sweden. We don't do that at all. We sort of, oh boy, they're up there by themselves. Right? Just economies of scale, they're going to have to pay. So we don't make it easy for you to go up there. So most Canadians have no direct experience. But look at another number that's interesting. There are more Indigenous people in the Toronto metropolitan area than in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut combined. Now, you never think of Toronto as an Indigenous area because the people come from all across the country. There's no one group of people. There are some local First Nations, but they come in from all the places to work and to find opportunities and things like that. So you have more Indigenous people there than you have in the far north. And what we do in Canada, and we do this with the North generally, not just with Indigenous people, is since we have no interest, we just send money. It's kind of like having a sort of a rogue child, who doesn't fit well with a family and is always causing problems. And, in Canada and Britain, British experience, we used to call them remittance men. And you'd have somebody who got the maid pregnant or something like that. And you say, gosh, you're an embarrassment. We're going to send you to British Columbia. And we're going to send you $100 a month to look after yourself, right? And so go over there and we'll forget about you. And it's a long tradition in the British Empire and things like that. It's kind of a sad one. But quite frankly, that's what we do in Canada. So we just send money, huge amounts of money. So the Yukon has 40,000 people, 48,000 people, 50,000, under that, not a very large population. And the government of Canada transfers $1.4 billion to the Yukon every year to fund their government. Well, that's a staggering amount of money for a small population like that. Northern Saskatchewan, which is actually the northern half of Saskatchewan, has the same population, so around 50,000, actually a little bit higher. And the federal transfer to northern Saskatchewan is effectively zero because the Yukon's a territory, and that's responsible to the government of Canada. Northern Saskatchewan is part of the province of Saskatchewan. Northern Saskatchewan has to pay for it. So in the Yukon, they can open up a university, they can build big hospitals, wonderful recreational facilities. They can build new subdivisions in town. They can do all sorts of things you can't do in the Yukon, you can't do in southern, the provincial north at all. So we feel guilty. And when we feel guilty, it doesn't make us change our behavior. It makes us send money. And we can look at, oh, look what we've done. They're well supported. We're spending lots of money. So if you look at Nunavut, I can't remember the exact number, but let's say it's about 4 times as much money per capita from the government of Canada as Newfoundland gets. And Newfoundland is a have-not province. It has very few resources right now. And so but Nunavut gets 4 times as much money per person for their 35 to 40,000 people. So we just use money as a surrogate for love. So if we really were interested, what's going on in the north? You'd go there. And then the first time, if we send Sandman and say, Sandman, go up to the north. Why don't you go up to the north? I guarantee, Sandman, you'd come back really quickly and say, hey, boss, do you see how much it costs to fly up there? It's going to cost me $3,000 just to go to Nunavut, just to go to Iqaluit. That's pretty expensive. And I'm not going to do it. And you get up there, the hotels cost more and the food costs more. Oh, I can't. I'm going to apply for a grant. Now, if you apply for a grant, they'll give you money. You'll send students up there, researchers up there. But to do it spontaneously, for $3,000, you can go for 3 weeks and go to the luxury resort in Mexico. Or you can go to a very poor indigenous community in Northern Northwest Territories. So we don't go. And so we don't have any kind of personal connections or any sense of, except a general sense of responsibility that we expiate basically by sending money. And we pat ourselves in the back and say, look at us, we're so really good. That frustrates the heck out of me. This is one of my big problems. And the infrastructure up north is terrible. These places that run diesel fuel power, we haven't got renewable energy for them. The road system's really terrible, as it is on most indigenous communities. We haven't got the proper roads, haven't got the proper ports, the airfields aren't great. There's a whole bunch of stuff we just don't do properly. Mm-hmm. And compared to the Nordic countries, even in Greenland, we're just falling way behind. And we could do so much better.
Mm-hmm. Again, I mean, what a wonderful way. And I'm a big fan by now of Dr. Ken Court's metaphors. And especially the last one, I liked it so much, the surrogate for love. So, Dr. Ken, we don't have a lot of time as per our planning. So a quick question back to you again. You have seen so much of these issues in the north, and can you talk a little bit and let us know what do you see in terms of security and defense changing? Of course, we know Chinese and Russians, etc. But given from the indigenous angle, what do you think we should really talk about now?
Okay.
For example, of course, with your recommendation, we go to some of the communities, but how should we start discussing about this matter?
Well, they're ready to discuss. They got lots of ideas, more than I will have, right? But I'll tell you a couple of things. Number one is listen to the northern concept of security, because it isn't all about making sure you have a soldier there to deflect the Russians, or a Air Force base to scare off the Chinese. Security means food security, security of energy, health and safety. So it's a much broader definition of security. So a northern definition of security is not like a simplistic one, the kind that you often have in southern areas, which is about, we have enough soldiers, have enough tanks, have enough airplanes, that sort of thing. And I think that's a really, really sort of important place to start, because, the northern people sort of have this very different view of sort of how it might also evolve as you sort of go along. Second point, recognize that the most profound change in the north has been the northern self-government, that the Yukon and Northwest Territories and Nunavut have a lot of autonomy. They control the resources now in those 3 jurisdictions. They have a lot of autonomy to run their own governments. The money comes from Ottawa, but they still are able to sort of make their own decisions. So this is not something Canada can do to the north. The minimum, it is something Canada can do with the north. And maybe to a certain extent we can do it for the north when we get to that point. So I think that concept of security is who's doing it and for whom as you sort of go along. The next point is, if you look at the north, there's one of the most interesting developments by far is the Canadian Rangers. And if you know the Rangers at all, they have a group that is very active across the entire north. They are sort of Canada's eyes on the Arctic. And not just the Arctic, they go on the west coast and stuff as well. But they're out there on the land, looking around and sort of watching for people, looking for disruptions, looking for intrusions into Canadian territory. And they're quite a remarkable group because they have an awful lot of local knowledge. They're really good on the land. They go out for a week by themselves on a snowmobile and come back a week later, and they were out there for all that time driving around, and they're safe, and they hunt for their own food and stuff like that. They're quite remarkable. And we're finally recognizing them not as some quaint little adjunct of the Canadian Armed Forces, but as a really central sort of way of protecting Canada's interest in the Arctic. And so I think we can strengthen indigenous engagement. But the other one, just to sort of make it more broader, it actually comes back to climate change. I know that's really important. You put these things together. The most important development in Canada in recent decades, it gets no attention at all, is the expansion of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And people don't even know that word. They don't what do you mean? It's, a couple of national parks. If you actually look what they've done, Canada has expanded greatly the number of areas that have very prominent Indigenous control. So Indigenous peoples are now managing the parks. And instead of having Southern forest rangers come up and manage the parks, they actually have Northern people who are living there and doing the work. And that's kind of so neat, right? Because they got their own, they're getting the jobs that are actually happening, and the work is actually coming back to the communities in major ways. This is all fantastic. But it's broader than that. There's wilderness preserves. There's protected areas that have special forestry and harvesting sort of opportunities and obligations. And those things, that's security too. And it's not just security, it's also, that's where the climate change work is going to happen. And as Indigenous people, this is going to become one of the primary employers of Indigenous people in the far north, is actually working on Indigenous protected and conserved areas, including national parks. And I think it's an amazing transformation. And for once, the Inuit and Northern people have been doing this for generations. They looked after it on their own. Now we're paying them to do it. We're actually creating jobs and giving them resources so they can go out and monitor. They can do some scientific research. They can collaborate with scientists and monitor people from the south. That's kind of a neat example of where the future is going. And I don't know the exact number, so don't really quote me on this, but the last estimate I saw was that Indigenous people control about 18% of all the land in Canada. And that's a lot. Canada's a big country. That's multiple Bangladeshs, right? That's an awful lot of territory, and it's largely thinly populated sort of areas. In the north, with the Yukon, for example, they have 11 First Nations or 14 First Nations. 11 have modern treaties. Each of those modern treaties controls about 10% of their traditional territory. They actually have that as settlement lands. Same with the Northwest Territories, same with Nunavut. These big chunks that are actually under Indigenous control. This is really neat because sometimes they develop resources on them. They can build mines on them if they want, or roads or whatever else. Sometimes they protect it for harvesting purposes. And that's kind of the frontier of both sovereignty and climate change set together. If the Indigenous people are actually managing the land, it's kind of hard to say these aren't Canadian lands. If the Indigenous people are managing the wildlife and actually monitoring the fish and the birds and the caribou and everything else, you can't say that they don't have an ongoing interest in the area. So I think this is one of the most exciting parts. And I don't know how much you know about that before. Maybe you knew all about it. But it's one of the most really interesting dynamic sort of elements to it, because they've moved from the periphery to center stage. And they're using this to train young people. They're bringing youth out there. They're doing the culture camps and taking young people out. I was in Carcross in the southern Yukon a while back, and they were sort of so excited because they've been slowly rebuilding the caribou herds. They used to be quite large down there. They're monitoring the harvest and slowly any kind of hunting down, all that kind of stuff. And the herd has been growing. So this fall, for the very first time in a long time, like decades, their elders were taking young people out on the land to actually shoot some caribou. So show them how to harvest them, how to skin them, and to bring the food back and share it with the community. I mean, this is life-giving stuff. This is going back to the essence of Indigenous life, living with the land, learning from the land, living and sharing the food amongst your people. It's that sort of intense relationship. So this is the kind of stuff that, we always talk about the bad things, but sometimes you just talk about the good things. And when you see that kind of development happening, you think, That's interesting. That's an expression of sovereignty. It's an expression. It's a response to climate change, to environmental management, to indigenous self-government, to indigenous autonomy and cultural revival. It's so many good things wrapped up in one.
Hmm. I think it's a very interesting concept, Dr. Ken Corsa, of human security, and it is more than the state-centric traditional security that we see. I think Dr. Ken Corsa is alluding to that. Thank you. Can we will just we have actually less than 5 minutes, but Dr. Haidar, who's also our research associate, he has an interesting question. But I think it's quite you have already hinted upon that, but nonetheless, let me read it out. He says, how can indigenous led governance models influence Canada's broader Arctic strategy, especially amid growing global interest and competition in this area?
That's a great question. So in other words, we're finally getting our act together in Canada, and how can we actually do something on a global scale? We thought we had the mechanism, and the mechanism was the Arctic Council, because the Arctic Council is one of the first international created by nation states organization that actually had the capacity to involve Indigenous people. So Indigenous people sit at the table in the Arctic Council as full members. They're not sitting there in the back corner where they used to sit. They can be observers. Now China's in the back corner. Japan, Korea, Singapore, India, they're in the back corners. They get to listen in. The European Union gets to listen in. But the people around the table include all the major Indigenous groups across the Arctic. Now, the Arctic Council has kind of stopped a lot of its work because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has made it very, very difficult to collaborate. And Russia's 50% of the Arctic. So it's kind of hard to have an Arctic Council when you have one of the major players sort of off the table. But those kinds of institutions where you create an institution, organization, a planning agency where Indigenous people are there not as sort of a member of the Canadian delegation, but as a delegate on their own terms, that is actually creating an interesting sort of phenomena. And what's interesting is that Indigenous folks on a global scale have an enormous amount of prestige and credibility. When you have an elder come to a meeting, an elder starts talking about their land and the life on the land and the significance of seal hunting. One of my most powerful lectures I've ever heard has been elders talking about the European attack on the seal harvest and how the Europeans banned the seal harvest because they were worried about the hurting of baby seals. So they banned seal imports into their area, and they destroyed Indigenous communities. Didn't harm them, they destroyed them. Communities that were basically 100% self-sufficient went from being welfare dependent in 12 months. It was a terrible thing. The Europeans were arrogant and self-centered and surrendered to activists without much thought at all. When you hear the elders talk about it, and if you listen to the elders, they'd say, we've been harvesting seals for a long time. We've never killed them all off. They haven't destroyed them. They're still flourishing. There's lots of them around. Sometimes there's too many now because they're not harvesting enough. If we listened to them, we would have come with a much better solution. They would have reassured non-European people and other people who live in their cities, and they have people run chicken farms that kill all the chickens, that they don't care because they only buy chickens from the store. They don't have to harvest the chickens themselves. So I'm not very sympathetic to that European worldview or Southern worldview generally. Let's get Indigenous people into our planning sessions. Let's make sure that they're there at the decision-making tables as partners as much as we possibly can. And now you have the government of Nunavut, Northwest Territories, which is a consensus-style government that's informed by Indigenous traditions. The Yukon just had an election. They had representatives. I think there's 4 out of 21 MLAs were elected from First Nations people. But every party had many, many Indigenous representatives, and Indigenous issues were front and center. So there's so many different ways that we can do this. And it all comes back to really simple things. Do you respect their worldview? And that's, if Dr. Hader, if you don't mind me sort of saying this, I don't mean this to you personally. If you actually poke people and say, do you really respect the fact that Indigenous people see the world differently than non-Indigenous people? Most Canadians would say, no, I don't respect that. I mean, that maybe don't respect it, I don't understand it, or I don't care about it. Well, any one of those 3 things. And yet to Indigenous people, that's fundamental. Because they do see the world in different ways. They understand the snow, they understand the birds, they understand the fish, they understand the caribou, they understand the seasons. They understand those things in different ways. And to them, it's like, you guys are very different. You folks just want to conquer the environment. You want to, so dominion over the land. We live with it. So we have to sort of, in one sense, Dr. Hinder, we have to sort of look at our own hearts, really hard in our own hearts, to say, are we doing this because we feel sorry for Indigenous people? Are we doing this because we think it's cute that they have these roles? That's nonsense. Indigenous people have real value to add to every conversation we're having in this country, not just about things in Northern affairs, but across the country as a whole. That's where we get started. We get started and then we back away. We get started, then we back away.
Wow. So what a profound comments. We are going to end, but our research assistant is very persuasive. He has a question. Sadman, you have to be very brief. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ken, for your valuable speech and comments. So my question was basically, as you put on the point of the Canadian Ranger, that they go out and they have about the part. So whenever we are talking about sovereignty and everything, so it's the most important thing is the resource and power, or the authority. What I say, the conflict actually rises in between these three variables.
Yes.
So one, due to this climate change, like my question was that due to this climate change, many of the permafrost are actually melting. Ships are able to come. So that means you have more resources. So the control over the resources and everything. So this is going to arise a conflict between other places. Like, as you said, 50% is basically Russia in the Arctic. And China is always there. Japan is also there. So in that perspective, this climate change and this changing climate and everything, as Canada is a bit away from the north. So about this northern security, how it impacts, and on the second half, on the authority. So in India, or if I go back, in British era, they actually had one army. In British Army, they had one group, or maybe a division called the Gurkha, which was basically the northern part. For the northern part, they had this.
Yes.
So is there any opportunity for the Canadian sphere to have these Indigenous people in the military like a separate division? Because whenever there is whenever it is a matter of security and sovereignty, obviously the people who know that place or who know that geography well are basically the most valuable resources when there is a chaos.
So that's a fantastic question, but I'd say a couple of things. Number one, as non-official military, the Rangers are doing some of that. And the interesting thing there is not that we have to expand the Rangers and make them into soldiers. We have to put our soldiers in with the Rangers so they learn from the Rangers. And they get to learn how they can rely on them and how they can travel with them and that sort of thing. That helps. But another context for you might be interesting. Indigenous Canadians enroll in the armed forces at a higher rate than other Canadians. And they always have. It goes back to World War I, World War II, and things of that nature. And they do it because, as often the case, and certainly I think is my understanding with the Gurkha was also the case, is that they wanted to prove they were real members of the Commonwealth or members of the Empire. They wanted to show that they could be as powerful as the British, and they were proud of their military prowess. That's the case with Indigenous folks. And the third point I would make is really interesting, is that the Aboriginal rights movement started substantially by World War II veterans. During World War II, they got trained recruited as soldiers. Some of them were really good. They're hunters, right? So, most urban people, here's a gun, which end do I point, right? Whereas the Aboriginal people have hunted their whole lives. And so they became very successful in the army. When they went over to Britain, they could go to the bars. They could date British women if they wanted to. They could walk around in the town they were treated like everybody else. And guess what happened when they came home? They couldn't vote. We're overseas fighting for democracy. We're fighting for Canadian freedom. We're fighting for Canadian principles. So they come back from there and say, you can't vote. Right? Unless you're enfranchised, you can't vote. Oh, you can't go in the Legion. Royal Canadian Legion, and let veterans who were Aboriginal people go in the Canadian Legion. You can't go in a bar. You can't drink. It was illegal until the mid-1960s for Aboriginal people to walk down the street with a bottle of beer in their hands. Even if it was closed, they couldn't have a bottle of beer. So, they're looking and say, what kind of country is this? They asked us to go over. My friends got killed. We with 5 years fighting on the Western Front, and now they come back and they say we're not real Canadians. A lot of those veterans were very powerful members of the Indigenous rights movement. If you go to a public meeting in Saskatchewan, where this is very strong, they always bring in the public meeting opens with the veterans walking in, usually with the flag. They've got their medals on, they've got the uniforms on, and they're extremely proud members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And the interesting thing there is that being in the armed forces as an Indigenous person ended up reinforcing their commitment to being Indigenous. It wasn't sort of now we're in a melting pot, now we're Canadians, we don't care about Indigenous people anymore. They came out of there thinking, yeah, okay, we're going to protect the rights of Indigenous people because that's one of the things we fought for. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. So I've never heard of Indigenous people sort of, demanding sort of a special unit. They had some in the United States. They had a couple in Australia as well. I'm not familiar with any in Canada that sort of tried to sort of set themselves up. But some of the most famous Canadian soldiers in World War I were First Nations people. Winners of the Victoria Cross and that sort of thing actually came from Winnipeg. So I think the armed forces can be a point of not integration in the sense of sort of cultural swarming, but integration in the sense of sort of walking proudly alongside other Canadians and making a real and concerted commitment. And so when you start putting a military operation in the north, there's not very many people from Toronto or from Montreal who are going to go up there and live there year round and sort of be there for 40 years as a member of the armed forces. But the local people want to, and they'll get jobs working in the hangars or working in the Air Force airports or working those kinds of things, and they'll show that pride of participation. And I think that's a really good way to go. It's a really good way to go. It's a great question.
Thank you, Dr. Ken. I think we are going to close this session, but I'm very delighted, and I'm very I feel myself way ignorant about so many aspects Dr. Ken put it up before us tonight. Just to end this session by saying that Dr. Ken, thank you so much for being with us and sort of guided us towards a direction where we would like to end up after this project. This is a very tiny project, Dr. Ken, and we are just trying to, let's say, bring people like you into the discussion and more Indigenous people into the discussion to understand the human security aspect of the whole matter rather than the state-centric tradition security.
Excellent.
And dear audience, you will be delighted to have this episode in our YouTube channel, and you can always go back and listen carefully what Dr. Ken said. And he talked about history, he talked about Indigenous participation, and what will make sense in terms of security and climate change. And this is something really ignored in our country for decades, as we have again heard. We often see, but we don't feel it, and that is the point, right? And we don't go and visit this area. He's very right and candid. How many of us actually ever thought that they will spend a summer, or let's say half of the summer, in our territories? None of us. See, we go to Mexico, we go to all other places in the world, but not in our own territory. So this is something I think need to be changed over the and I think this is the starting point of our discussion in this project, which might bring some awareness amongst us. Thank you, Dr. Ken, for your wonderful and very explicit discussions what we need to do in the future. And we are going to be in touch with Dr. Ken moving forward in this project as well. And on behalf of the Institute, we would like to express our deep gratitude for his time and for his wisdom tonight, and which will remain very important for us in this project. And stay well, Dr. Ken, and please be with us. We'll be needing your guidance quite a bit, I believe, in the next couple of months and we are going to invite Dr. Ken in Winnipeg, our workshop, and in Ottawa, because I think people need to listen to his wisdom as well, in this project and what we should really achieve. Thank you so much. Once again, stay well and stay fine. Till the next episode, we'll meet each other again. Bye-bye.
You're more than welcome. You're more than welcome.